Good evening. It's great to have you with us again on session 7 of our Holocaust studies. And we've looked at a number of aspects of Holocaust. And finally, last week, we looked at the death camps. But today we're on session 7, and we're going to look at some aspects of Holocaust that maybe some of you have not examined and not looked at or even thought about. Things like abortion, eugenics, and those sort of things are subjects that took place in Holocaust or were part of Holocaust that many of us don't look at because we look at the main aspects of it, the camps, the ghettos, the killing fields, etc., etc. So I want us to go a little bit deeper tonight in regard to eugenics. Now, I want to say this first of all. Hitler was wasn't just a mad, vicious anti-Semite. He actually wanted to drain every bit of Jewish blood from every family within Europe and the world. And if he'd have had his way, if he'd have won the war in Second World War, then Jews would never have been able to have children. Jews would have had they would have been murdered en masse. We know 6 million were murdered, but Hitler had a plan to murder 11 million, and he also had a plan already in place to murder the Jews of the Middle East. But his idea was that he wanted to drain everybody of Jewish blood. So if you had Jewish blood in you, you were to be killed. You were to die. So this is what his aim was, and that was his purpose. Such was the evil that was in his heart. Of course, he didn't do this in isolation. He convinced others to do the killing and to murder Jews en masse, and that's what he did, eventually killing 6 million innocent men, women, and children of the Jewish race. But he also killed people who were infirm or, as he called them, feeble-minded or unfit for life. So we can see that deep within him was a passion to annihilate anybody who wasn't fit for life as an Aryan. So where did these ideas come from, and what formed the ideas? Well, we have to look at the eugenics program that started in the late 19th century, first of all in the UK, and then later on in America, and how that fed into Hitler's plan to murder every Jewish man, woman, and child, so that they would never, ever have children again, and that would be the end of the Jewish race. So the book that I'm going to recommend to you tonight is a wonderful piece of research that has helped me enormously recently. Although I taught this session a few months ago in church, in the Father's house, with my small group of students who were looking at Holocaust, and we looked at eugenics. And my research then involved Christian eugenics ideas coming from people like Walter Grundmann, who we've mentioned on this course, and the German Christian Party, and also American eugenics. We went through a lot of that. But if you're wanting to go further and wanting to study it for yourself, this book, War Against the Weak, which is Eugenics in the Americas Campaign to Create a Master Race, is probably the best research book that you'll ever read on the subject of American eugenics and how that fed into Nazi Germany. It's by an author called Edwin Black, who is a journalist, but he's an amazing researcher as well. And Edwin Black had 50 other researchers helping him to create this book. And if you can read the book, it's really worth reading. It's quite heavy going. It really is heavy going. But it gives you an idea of how involved the Americans were on the eugenics program with Germany, but his main thrust is eugenics in America and the sterilization programs that took place then. And he gives you a flavor of more than a flavor, actually, in-depth study of what was happening in America during the 1920s and 1930s with regard to eugenics. And also a little book that I've read just recently because of my involvement in the pro-life movement. I've read a book by Margaret Sanger, who was the founder of Planned Parenthood, who was a eugenicist, and she called this book Women and the New Race. And in that she speaks about the feeble-minded and how worthless they are, and how people from lower sections of society should not be allowed to have children. And she speaks highly in favor of contraception, birth control. She's actually against abortion. Isn't that strange? But I've read that book as well, and that Margaret Sanger was a eugenicist, and she was involved in eugenics in the 1920s and 1930s, and that's helped me to understand things about the pro-life movement and how it was founded. But I'm going to go to my notes now, and we're going to start first of all by looking at the word, or what does eugenics mean? What does the word eugenics actually mean? Well, the definition is it's the science of improving a population by controlled breeding to increase the occurrence of desirable hereditable characteristics. Now, when you put that in those terms, if you imagine what Hitler was talking about with an Aryan race, you can fit that definition into Hitler's plan to annihilate and murder the Jewish people, because he wanted to improve the Aryan race, and he believed that Jewish blood would taint the Aryan race, and had tainted it. In fact, he believed. Of course, that is absolutely wrong, but this definition fits with his plan to murder the 6 million Jews of Europe. So that's the definition for eugenics. But I want to go back in history and look at eugenics, because it's no good just studying something in isolation in a particular generation, in a particular place, as we are going to look at with Holocaust. We have to look at where it comes from and how it feeds into Nazi German ideology. So I'm going to go back in history. Now, first of all, I want to go back as far as 378 BC, when Plato initiated the idea that selective breeding would improve human beings. And that was really the thing that the UK eugenicists in the late 19th century believed, and also in America in the 1900s onwards. Now, that was, so Plato said that in 378 BC. The Italian philosopher Tommaso Campanale wrote in 1623, only the elite should be allowed to procreate. And that's what he believed. Now, we can move forward a long way now, and there is a lot of history between those two major players in the eugenics movement in history. But I want to move to Sir Francis Galton in the UK, who died in 1911. And he, by the way, was the half cousin to Charles Darwin. And in 1869, he proposed a system of arranged marriages between men of distinction and women of wealth, who he said would produce a gifted race. And that was in the UK in 1911. Now, Galton wrote this. He said, we greatly want to express the science of improving the stock to give the suitable races or strains of blood a better chance of prevailing speedily over the less suitable than they otherwise would have had. So he talks about blood, and when we look at Nazi Germany and their ideology, they speak about a pure Aryan blood, and they say they don't want that, as I've said earlier, tainted by Jewish blood in any way. Now, Darwin used similar ideas to Galton to progress his theories of selective breeding. Darwin used terminology such as good stock and defective stock. And we see that very much used, and those ideas about good stock and defective stock being used in America in the early 1900s with the America's Breeding Association, which was initially for animals, but actually moved into the idea of human good stock or bad stock. And then I want to take us now to a man called Gregor Mendel, who was an Austrian scientist who died in 1884. Now, Hitler was an Austrian, and he would have known about Mendel. He discovered through his breeding of garden peas the basic principles of heredity and laid the mathematical foundation of the science of genetics. He formulated several basic genetic laws, including the law of segregation, the law of dominance, and the law of independence. Independence assortment, in what became known as the Mendelian inheritance. So the idea came from growing peas, originally how you were able to create a better pea from selective breeding. Now, from the late 19th century onwards, eugenicists in the USA, supported by scientists from numerous universities and financed by rich capitalists, rich capitalists, called for a pure race of Americans who would have pure Nordic blood. Now, this was in the late 1800s, very late 1890. So the American eugenicists spoke of a pure Nordic blood. The American eugenics industry, because that's what it became, envisaged that those unfit or from non-Nordic blood should be rounded up and detained in colonies, camps, and farms, and thus sterilized. They planned for a super race for America and ultimately Europe, so that the population of the world would ultimately be a superior, and again I quote, a superior Nordic race without defect. So that was before Hitler wrote Mein Kampf, and we're going to discuss Mein Kampf very shortly. So the idea in America was for Americans to reach that place where they were of pure Nordic blood. Now, in 1912, Harvard University professor Robert de Courcy called for eugenic screening of immigrant candidates into America before they left their own country of origin. In 1917, the American Immigration Committee Congress created a statute which barred the immigration of what was described as idiots, imbeciles, feeble-minded, epileptics, insane persons, and persons who were psychopathically inferior. In 1920, eugenicist Henry Hamilton Laughlin, who was a big player in the eugenicist movement, argued that family background should be investigated before allowing entry into the USA to prevent what he called the admittance of degenerate blood. In 1923, the Carnegie Institution in the USA, with the aid of the eugenicist Charles Davenport, began a campaign to keep out what they called defective immigrants. In 1924, Laughlin wrote a booklet classifying those who he considered were genetically capable of passing on criminal or degenerate traits. Now, what Laughlin and Davenport believed was that the prison population was made up of people who were from a lower class of people, who were from a particular non-Nordic blood group, and that they were the ones who had children who became criminals or subversive or antagonistic to the state. obviously they believed that these people, these degenerates, were a drain on the finances of the American people, because what they claimed was that the parents would breed children who would end up in prison or be a burden on the state, which caused the state to expend huge amounts of finances in looking after them. Now, he created the idea of having a point system for people who they considered to be unfit, and of a non-Nordic group of people. Now, you may wonder why we're going down this road, but I need to give the background here, and I need to keep using this word Nordic race, because it feeds into Hitler's Aryan race story as well. But with this classification, Laughlin wrote a booklet classifying those who he considered were genetically capable of passing on criminal or degenerate traits. Now, he classified German Jews as number 15 in their classification. Polish Jews were 16, Russian Jews 17, 18 was Spanish Americans who looked like the native Indians. And then the classification 25 was Northern Italian, and 30 was Polish, 29 was Russian. And Laughlin claimed that degeneracies and hereditary handicaps were inherent in blood. And that's the key to our following this through. Now, you may say, well, what about the classifications? How did that work out? Well, those classifications were important when it came to collecting data prior to the Second World War by the Nazis, with the help of American data collection analysis who were working for IBM. And we're going to look at that. I don't think we'll get there tonight, but we will look at that and how America helped with the data collection and classification of people throughout Europe, Eastern Europe as well, prior to the First World War, prior actually to the time 1938 onwards. And the classification was in regard to hereditary handicaps, as I say, in the blood. That's what Laughlin believed. And he was well respected and supported. Now, in America, the idea of eugenics was quite commonplace, and it was well understood even by ordinary people who understood that or believed that those from an inferior background would cause great drains on the finances of America, and they wanted, and the idea of preserving racial integrity, as they called it, racial blood, was commonplace. And I have in front of me a poster which is by the Virginia Health Authority, and it's dated 1924, March 1924, and the heading on it is the new Virginia law to preserve racial integrity. So it was commonplace, and that law was in regard to sterilizing people who that particular state considered unfit, feeble-minded, insane, epileptics, etc. And that sterilization took place right across America in various states, but Virginia is the one that's quoted here. They were the one that passed the first law regarding eugenics. Now, if you get onto Google and you have a look at posters regarding eugenics in America, you'll come across a number of posters. I've got another a poster here, which is from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, dated 1926. And on this poster, it says, "Some people are born to be a burden on the rest." You can Google these and you can see them and study them for yourself. In 1902, in a paper called In Blood of a Nation, Stanford University in the States president, David Jordan, wrote that qualities of talent and poverty were passed through the blood and argued that minority races were tainting the bloodline. Now, that was in 1902. Eugenics in the USA progressed to a point whereby the idea of eugenics involving bloodlines pervaded thinking in Scandinavian European countries, China, Russia, and South American countries. And supporters of eugenics included President Roosevelt and Supreme Court Justice John Marshall Harlan. So major politicians were behind the idea of the blood of the nation, if you like, the involving bloodlines, and the whole idea of eugenics, and this idea of minor races, as David Jordan spoke about. Now, funds from various US foundations helped to progress the research into eugenics, and they gave it credibility. British scientists, including J.B.S. Holden and Julian Huxley, who incidentally was the first director of UNESCO, supported this theory. The result was mass sterilization of US citizens who were considered unfit to procreate. So if you were from a lower class, you were unfit to populate. I've read a lot of books about eugenics now and touched on it. And I'm from a big family. My mother had 11 children. Only 7 of us survived. We would have been the targets of the sterilization program. Because we were from a poor background, we didn't have much money. We didn't claim anything off the state, however, because my father worked throughout his life. He worked hard throughout his life, farming and working in industry. But if you had a big family and you weren't terribly well educated, as I and my other members of my family weren't, then you would be targets of this sterilization program, and we would have been considered unfit to procreate, because the idea would have been that if Michael Fryer is from a big family, a poor family, then my children I would pass that on to my children, and they would become poor and large families and poorly educated. As it happened, some of my family became quite rich and wealthy, but in American terms, we wouldn't have had a chance to have grown into people who could support themselves and support the communities around them, because they believed we would have been unworthy of procreation and would have been subject to sterilization. In 1911, the Carnegie Foundation in the USA supported a eugenics report which suggested 18 solutions for the best means for cutting off the defective germplasm in the human population. And the 8th point was euthanasia of the unfit to be implemented through public, locally operated gas chambers. Now, maybe you're getting an idea now why I've looked at this aspect of American eugenics in that way, because as Edwin Black makes very clear, and other researchers make clear, there are connections. So I'll go through this again, just so that you can get it clear in your mind. In 1911, the Carnegie Foundation in the USA supported a eugenics report. Actually, the Carnegie Foundation supported Laughlin and Davenport, who we've just read about. And they called for the best means for cutting off defective germplasm in the human population. And they believed it was in the blood, hereditary passing on. And the 8th point, which is the point that actually startled me when I came to see this in the research, is that it was the euthanasia of the unfit to be implemented through public, locally operated gas chambers. Sorry, I needed to go over that again for you. Now, In 1927, I just want to raise a case, a eugenics case for you that might be of interest to you. And actually, it makes the point about feeble-minded um, people, or people of poor education, such as myself, if you like. And you can research this yourself again on Google. And if you Google it, it's a case which is well documented. It was in 1927, and it was a case of Buck v. Bell. And it's a Buck v. Bell, and in the Supreme Court, where Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. said, who is the prosecutor, who said, it is better for all the world if, instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime, or let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind, which is really the idea of Margaret Sanger, which was to not to sterilize, but to use birth control to restrict the lower classes or the feeble-minded. Now, in 1916, Harry Laughlin, going back to Laughlin again, of the USA, published a book called The Passing of the Great Race, which in 1920 initiated a number of congressional hearings concerning what was described as the dilution of the American race by allowing, this is what it said, by allowing immigration from Italy, Greece, and Eastern Europe. And Laughlin claimed immigrants from these places made up the majority of prisoners in the USA at that time. That's why I quoted that research about him with the classification. In 1924, as a result of the USA, as a result of this, the USA passed an immigration law. So this law was passed called the Restrictive Immigration Bill, which restricted the immigration of people into the USA. And these laws gave quotas for the immigration of Jews, Slavs, and Southern Europeans, the exact people who would eventually seek sanctuary before and during World War II. And if you've been on the course, on the sessions with us, and maybe you've looked at the Hidden Treasures course, and sometimes we quote the case of the St. Louis, the ship, the St. Louis, which was a ship taking, just before the war, taking Jews to Cuba. And when they weren't allowed into Cuba, they came on the shores of the States and asked if they could leave and be accepted into America, and Roosevelt turned them down. And I think certainly the American public were told that it was because there were quotas, but I think it was the Restrictive Immigration Bill that gave the quotas and said that the quotas were to restrict the immigration of Jews and Slavs and Southern Europeans. So we need to go into depth into these things to look at why things like quotas, and we had quotas in the UK as well, why quotas were initiated. Now, by 1922, 3,200 individuals across the USA had already been involuntarily sterilized. So this was an involuntary thing. By 1929, 9,000 had been involuntarily sterilized. By 1938, more than 30,000 Americans considered unfit to carry on having children were involuntarily sterilized. And a total of 60,000 people were involuntarily sterilized in the USA before the war, before the law was repealed in 1976. So even after the war, the sterilization, the involuntary sterilization of people who were considered not worthy of having children was still in being, and people were still being sterilized. And as I say, that was only repealed in 1976. I'm going to go back now a little bit because we're going to start looking at European eugenicists and the idea of the eugenics movement within Europe, which was the foundation of Nazi eugenicists' ideas. So I'm going to go back now. We've looked at some aspects of the American eugenics movement, but before I go any further, actually, I want to say that this is a major aspect of American life in the 1920s, 1910, 1920s, and 1930s. So I've spoken about it just for a few minutes, haven't I? I've just gone into it in a few short minutes, but actually it could take you a whole life. As I say, Edwin Black had 50 researchers looking at this question of eugenics in America. So if you can get, I think I've given you a flavor of the idea of the eugenics movement in America and what they called their search for a pure Nordic race. Now we move to Europe, as I say. So in 1853, French diplomat Arthur de Gobineau, I don't know if I pronounced that properly, who was a proponent of the racial theory, argued that the purity of race, this was in 1853, indicated survival. He said the purest race was the Aryan race, as can be testified, he said, by their human body proportions, facial composition, which were signs of their inner character. Now, I've said, haven't I, that Hitler was an anti-Semitic, vicious, evil madman to an extent. But these ideas that he wrote on were around since 1853 in Europe. Now, Stewart Chamberlain, who was born in the UK in 1855 and he died in 1927, was considered both a German philosopher and an English author of books on political philosophy. He was from a German background. He claimed that the intellectual abilities and superiority of the Germanic peoples were being threatened by Jews. So this is what Stewart Chamberlain said in 1927. Sorry, he died in 1927. And he was a well-respected German philosopher, and as I say, an English author of books on political philosophy. So he said that the superiority of the German peoples were being threatened by Jews. In Germany in 1924, Dr. Ottmar Freiherr Verschuer, and that's Verschuer, and that's a name you really need to make a note of if you're studying eugenics in Holocaust, because Verschuer influenced Mengele, and actually Mengele was answerable to him, and Verschuer was heavily involved with the Americans' eugenicist movement. Now, he was an anti-Semite, a rabid anti-Semite, and he said that fighting Jews was an integral part of Germany's eugenics battle for race hygiene. He said that Jewish penetration into German society was a threat to a pure German Aryan race. Now, he wrote that the complete racial separation between Germans and Jews was an absolute necessity. He also called for sterilization of the unfit. So when Hitler wrote Mein Kampf, my struggle, which Mein Kampf means my struggle, the idea of a super Aryan race with a total separation of Jewish blood from German society was already being promulgated throughout German medical institutions. And what it did, it compounded his already anti-Semitic genocidal views. And he used the American eugenics principles, which he was aware of, to reinforce his argument for a super German Aryan race free of Jews. By 1934, collaboration between German and American eugenicists was taking place regularly, particularly at that time, on the data collection of Jews and the data collection of all those who were considered unfit for life, and people who had epilepsy, people who were feeble-minded, not academics, were considered unfit for life, people who were physically and mentally challenged. Now, when we look at these dates, we've been looking at dates, haven't we, around 1920, 1921, 22, 23, and 24. We see that Hitler was in prison writing Mein Kampf. And I have a copy, as you know, of Mein Kampf here. And what he said at one point, he said, what we must fight for is to safeguard the existence and reproduction of our race and our people, the sustenance of our children and the purity of our blood. Again, that the purity of blood, which was spoken about by the American eugenicists, goes on to say, the purity of our blood, the freedom and independence of the fatherland, so that our people may mature for the fulfillment of the mission allotted it by the creator of the universe. So he believed that he was doing this on behalf of God to create a pure people, a pure Aryan race, excluding any Jewish blood whatsoever. Now, in the early 1930s, Germany began to follow the eugenics, the USA eugenics program. And Nazi Germany began programs in the 1930s of involuntary sterilization of persons who were described by them as socially inferior. So we have Germany copying the sterilization that was taking place in America of people who, as Nazis said, were socially inferior. But that idea was already very prevalent in American society. Now, we have a letter from an SS officer called Professor Karl Astel to Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, dated the 14th of June, 1937. And if you can just keep in mind what we've taught about America, you'll get some idea of what Karl Astel was talking about when he wrote to Himmler on the 14th of June. He said, I would also like to tackle a major project on criminals. I want to establish the incidence of a certain degree of criminality in the set of criminals to work out the yardstick for the inclusion of criminals in the law on the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring with a view to sterilizing. So these questions were being asked within the upper echelons of the Nazi Party in 1937, and they were prevalent in the thinking. Eugenics was an important factor in the work of the Nazi Party. The law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring, proclaimed on July the 14th, 1933 now, required physicians in Germany to register every case of hereditary illness known to them. except in women over 45 years of age. Physicians could be fined for failing to comply. In 1934, the first year of the law's operation, nearly 4,000 people appealed against the decisions of sterilization authorities. 3,559 of the appeals failed. By the end of the Nazi regime, over 200 genetic health courts had been created, and under their rulings, over 400,000 people were sterilized against their will. And that included German people who were socially unfit, as they were called. And of course, Jews as well. But they set up courts, and so I'll go through those figures again. The 4,000 people appealed against the forced involuntary sterilization, and they appealed to these genetic health courts, but only but 3,559 of those appeals failed. So very few people actually won their appeal. In 1930, the Nazi Party, who supported the criminalization of homosexuality, lesbianism, described homosexuals and lesbians in their magazine as the consequence of all the foul urges of the Jewish soul. This is what the Nazi Party believed, that sexual issues were as a result of the Jewish bloodline. This view had manifested itself into the arrest and detention and sterilization, including castration of homosexuals and sterilization of lesbians, under something called Section 175 of the Reich Penal Code, in an effort, they said, to keep the Aryan blood pure. And as I said, they blamed the Jews for somebody having lesbian or homosexual traits. Now, between 1933 and 1945, 5,000 homosexuals and lesbians had been deported to concentration camps in an effort, as the Nazi Party said, to keep the blood pure. Now, we've spoken a little bit about the physically and medically and mentally ill, and Germany murdered many people in that category. Now, after the war, this program of murder of German people who were ill or poorly in some way was called the T4 program. And if you Google that, you can see a lot of information on the T4 program. We've been teaching about this program at a place called Applerbeck on our Hidden Treasures course when we look at Holocaust. But I just want to make you aware that the program about the murder of people who had illnesses was called the T4 program. Now, the T4 is the post-war name for the mass murder of physically, medically, and mentally ill people by involuntary euthanasia, murdered by medical practitioners. The murders took place from September 1939 until the end of the war in 1945. Initially, it was thought that approximately 70,000 people were murdered, but that figure is now believed to be 275,000, maybe 300,000. Certainly, it was a lot more than 70,000 people, as was thought after the war. Most of the murders were carried out in psychiatric hospitals in Germany and Austria, occupied Poland, and the Czech Republic. About half of those who were killed were taken from church-run asylums, often with the approval of the Protestant or Catholic authorities of those particular institutions. It is understood that racial hygiene, eugenics, and cost were the motives for these murders. Well, they certainly were the motives for the murders of these poor people. Now, I'm going to speak about the killing of children with disabilities. From August 1939, the Interior Ministry registered children with disabilities, requiring doctors and midwives to report all cases of newborns with severe disabilities. The Guardian consent elements soon disappeared. Those to be killed were identified as all children under the age of 3 years of age in whom any of the following serious hereditary diseases were suspected. And that's the wording, suspected. These are the diseases they considered: idiocy, Down syndrome, microcephaly, hydrocephaly, malformations of all kinds, especially of limbs, head, and the spinal column, and paralysis, including spastic conditions. Now, where was the church in all this? Well, we've spoken a lot about Christian anti-Semitism, but can we tie up eugenics with the Christian movement, the German Christian movement in particular? Can we tie up and produce some evidence that leaders within the German Christian movement were in favor of eugenics? Well, I've spoken a lot about Walter Grundmann, who was the leader of, or one of the leading theologians in the German Christian movement. Now, in 1933, Grundmann founded a monthly magazine, and it was called The Cross and the Swastika, in which he taught that Jesus was an Aryan. He taught that Christianity had to be clean in terms of blood and race, and that German Christianity was the only Christianity which was clean. He also wrote in the same book, the same monthly magazine rather, that Hitler was instituting a divine order. So the leader of the German Christian Party, or one of the leading theologians, Walter Grundmann, who, as you know from my previous teaching about Grundmann, actually had influence over the Protestant movements in the UK after the war, because Grundmann, after the war, wasn't dealt with for his war crimes, and he taught that Jesus was an Aryan because he was in favor of the idea of pure Aryan blood. And we know that Grundmann started the Institution for the Eradication of Jewish Life within the German church. And Grundmann was an absolute rabid anti-Semite, and he sought for the eradication of every Jew within Christendom. Now, this led Grundmann to writing a thesis which was called the 28, a racial church which was united by blood and race. He made it clear that baptized Jews within the church were different, forbidding them from serving or governing in any way. He said that the Volt Church, German church, should confess its faith in blood and race. You can see his absolute eugenicist, but also absolute anti-Semite. He made it clear that there was no conflict between Nazi racial policies and the German church. So now we have the American eugenics movement influencing the Nazi eugenicists who were aiming to murder every Jew within their occupied territory. And also you have the church, the German Christian Movement Church, the Protestant church in Germany, supporting the idea of eugenics and the idea of a pure blood Aryan race, teaching that Jesus was an Aryan. On the 19th of April 1934, Grundmann invited the racial theorist Hans F.K. Gunther to speak at a conference on the subject of racial hygiene of the German people and Christianity. That meeting inspired German pastors to call for the forced sterilization program for those who did not have Aryan blood. See how the church was so forceful in this eugenics program. On the 5th to the 7th of February 1935, this is 4 years before the war started, a seminar was arranged for pastors to teach them how to identify candidates for sterilization. And when we look at the data gathering, it was pastors and the medical profession who identified people for data classification. Now, theologians wanted to turn rhetoric into action by helping with sterilization program for Jews, thereby eradicating Jews from German society. But not just eradicating a Jew, but making sure that anyone who was in relationship with blood relationship with Jews, so a German who was married to a Jew would not be able to have children. And that was the idea that German society had and the German church had. And Gunther, this eugenicist, racial theorist, if you like, spoke at this organized Christian conference, which influenced pastors who attended. Now, racial purity was an obsession for Nazis who wanted a master race of intellectually and physically dominant people. Eugenics became an obsession in Germany, as it was in America in some parts of the States. In July 1934, two decrees were promulgated amongst the medical profession. First of all, the law for simplification of the health system and the law for prevention of genetically sick offspring. And that really, for me, fits in with the law that was voted on today for Northern Ireland, where genetically sick babies in the womb will be aborted just because they maybe have cleft lip or maybe a club foot. The idea comes from America and Nazi Germany. It's the teaching on the eugenics program for Nazi Germany actually highlights a lot of issues that we have in our society, which are degrading our society today. They're not new ideas that were voted on today in Parliament. They are actually ideas that were around with the American eugenics sterilization program and Nazi Germany. Now, the idea of sterilization, which originated in the USA, was now a target of Nazi Germany, and doctors were instructed to keep records of persons who were either Jewish or had issues with regard to their medical situation. And doctors were, as I say, instructed to keep records of persons on something called a holorith machine. And the holorith machine kept data, and we're going to look at that. We won't be able to look at it tonight in any depth, but we are going to look at that. But again, Edwin Black, a fantastic author, wrote this book, and it's called IBM and the Holocaust, because this holorith machine that was created by IBM was used in Nazi Germany to record data regarding Jews and the mentally or physically ill. And we're going to look at that next week, we'll have a look at the Hollerith machine and how data was collected. But I think we'll wind up now by saying that the eugenics movement and the ideas that were created in the UK with Galton in the late 1800s and actually came into the American psyche and ultimately caused the involuntary sterilization of people who in America were considered unfit. They'd also affected the immigration of Jews who were fleeing from persecution in Europe, and then how that influenced Nazi Germany, and particularly Hitler and Himmler and many of the hierarchies, including Mengele, to nail down with the principles used in America the idea that it was good for the German race to annihilate and murder every Jew within the occupied territories. And in fact, if Hitler and the eugenics movement had not been stopped by the Allies, then we would have seen probably the total annihilation of the Jewish race, because Hitler, as I said, wanted to murder 11 million Jews within Europe, those Jews within the UK, and Jews in the Middle East, because he worked with the Arabs to plan for the annihilation of Jews of the Middle East, and eventually worldwide. So we are grateful to the Allies that they beat back Hitler, but the eugenics movement of America has a lot to answer for. And next week we will look at not only the eugenics movement, but how Germany knew who their targets were, and they were able to efficiently arrest Jews and take them to the gas chambers. So I hope that you've learned something tonight. I find this subject very difficult, but very important in our study of Holocaust, and I hope you feel the same about that. So we'll see you next week at 7 o'clock, and hope that you've been able to, and I will be able to, look a little bit further into this question of eugenics. So thank you very much for being with me tonight, and I hope you have a good evening. So Lila Toff, good night.